There's a version of this question that gets asked in comment sections 100 times a week, and it almost always gets the same answer. It depends on the dog. That's true, and it's also useless because it tells you nothing about why it depends or which dogs you should actually be worried about. So, let's do this properly. Because the honest answer isn't a shrug, it's a set of specific, knowable factors. And once you understand them, you can predict the outcome with a lot more confidence. Then every dog is an individual. Start with the uncomfortable part. Terriers were not bred as companion animals who happen to end up in our living rooms. They were bred, in almost every case, to find, chase, and kill small mammals in tight spaces. That is not a personality quirk. That is the job description. Border Terriers went to ground after foxes. Jack Russells were built to bolt rats and rabbits from burrows. Bull Terriers were refined for ratting pits before they were refined for anything else. When you bring a terrier into a house with a cat, you are not asking, will my dog be friendly? You are asking, will my dog's several hundred-year-old occupational instinct override its affection for this specific animal? And that is a much more precise and much more answerable question. Here's where most advice videos get lazy, though, because they treat terrier as one category with one prey drive setting. It isn't. There's enormous variation within the group, and if you're actually trying to make a decision about a real dog and a real cat, the variation matters more than the label. At one end, you've got the terriers bred for a narrower, more contained job. Border Terriers, for instance, worked alongside hounds, going to ground to bolt a fox rather than kill it outright, which meant a degree of biddability and impulse control was actually useful to their handlers. Airedales were bred as general utility dogs, retrieving as much as ratting, which softened their prey response compared to dogs bred purely for vermin control. Bedlington Terriers, despite that lamb-like look, were bred for poaching work that demanded silence and restraint, not blind pursuit. At the other end, you've got breeds where the entire point was an uninterruptible chase and kill response. Jack Russells and Patterdales were selected almost exclusively for the ability to pursue something small and fast into a hole and finish the job without hesitation. That's not a flaw in the breeding. That's the breeding working exactly as intended. And it means a Patterdale sizing up your cat is drawing on a much more direct, much less negotiable instinct than a Border Terrier is. So, the breed matters. But here's the part that actually changes outcomes in real households. And it's the part most of these videos skip past to get to the dramatic footage. The individual dog's rearing history is doing at least as much work as its genetics, and in a lot of cases, more. A terrier raised from 8 weeks old alongside a resident cat is learning something very different from a terrier meeting its first cat at 18 months. Early exposure during the socialization window, which for most dogs runs from roughly 3 to 14 weeks, is when a puppy's brain is still building its category system for things in my environment. A puppy that spends that window sleeping next to a cat, getting swiped on the nose a couple of times, and generally absorbing that the cat is furniture rather than quarry, tends to file cat under family rather than prey. That filing decision, made early, is remarkably durable. It's why you'll see plenty of Jack Russells who've grown up with the household cat, and genuinely could not care less. While a rescue Jack Russell with no early cat exposure can be an absolute liability around one. This is also why breed alone is such a poor predictor in individual cases. A high-drive breed raised right, with genuine early cohabitation, sensible management, and a cat that isn't intimidated into constant fleeing, will very often outperform a supposedly gentler breed that's never encountered a cat until adulthood. Novelty and unfamiliarity are doing a lot of the work in prey drive triggering. A moving, unfamiliar small animal is a much stronger trigger than a familiar one that the dog has learned through hundreds of boring repetitions is not going anywhere and not worth chasing. There's a second factor that gets almost no attention. and it's the cat's own behavior. Prey drive isn't just switched on by the dog. It's substantially triggered by movement, and specifically by fast, erratic, fleeing movement. A confident cat that stands its ground, holds eye contact, or simply ignores the dog is giving off almost none of the signals that activate a chase response. A nervous, newly introduced cat that bolts the second the dog enters the room is doing the single most effective thing possible to get chased. This is why the same terrier can seem perfectly safe with one household cat and genuinely dangerous with another. You're not just testing the dog, you're testing a relationship between two temperaments, and either animal can be the variable that tips it. None of this means you can override genetics with a good introduction and a confident cat. It means those things shift the odds substantially, but they don't erase the underlying instinct. A well-socialized Patterdale that adores the family cat can still, in a split second, respond very differently to a strange cat sprinting across a garden. The learned association is specific. It applies to a known individual in a known context, and it doesn't necessarily generalize to cats as a category. This is the single most common way these situations go wrong. Owners see years of calm behavior with their own cat and conclude the dog is safe around cats generally, when in fact the dog has simply learned that this particular animal isn't prey. Take that same dog to a friend's house with an unfamiliar cat, and you're rolling the genetic dice all over again. So, if you're actually trying to make this decision, here's what the evidence and the behavioral history point to. Choose, where you can, a breed from the lower end of the prey drive spectrum if a cat is already in the picture or is coming later. Get exposure happening as early as physically possible, ideally within that puppy socialization window, and make it prolonged rather than a single supervised meeting. Manage the introduction so the cat has an escape route and isn't forced into a corner, because a trapped cat behaves exactly like a fleeing one, and that's the worst possible outcome for triggering pursuit. And accept that a dog raised successfully with one cat is not automatically safe with all cats. So any new animal entering that household still gets the same careful introduction, regardless of how relaxed the resident pairing has become. The uncomfortable truth underneath all of this is that terriers weren't built for cats, and no amount of good management fully erases that fact. But it also means the question was never really, can terriers live with cats? It's which terrier, raised how, with which cat, under what conditions. Get those variables right, and you'll see terriers who treat the family cat as a genuine companion. Get them wrong, and you're relying on instinct restraint that was never selected for in the first place.